The teacher just assigned groups, your boss just put you on a new team, or you've been named the captain of your sports team, and now you have no idea what to do. You have to rally together a group of people who might not know each other or want anything to do with one another. You gotta rally them together to succeed on a specific task in a set amount of time. How do we do this? Well, Julius Caesar, we've all heard the name, right? Dictator and emperor of Rome. Didn't have a great ending, but when he was emperor of Rome, he had a special set of strategies he used that set him apart as a leader, that made him a great leader, and people have been using these strategies throughout history. We want to figure out what were some of these strategies. We won't be able to cover all of them, but I'm going to be covering two that I think are the most important. What are these strategies? How can we implement them into our own lives? And why the heck are they so effective? In today's episode of What Sets Them Apart, we're going to be looking at two specific stories from the life of Julius Caesar that I believe we can implement into our own lives. They're going to be super simple to implement. That's the guarantee in today's episode. And it's going to turn us into great leaders within our own lives if we can implement these. So starting off, picture this. It's 45 BC. The Battle of Minda is about to begin. This is the final battle of the civil war at the time that he was fighting, and this win would actually eventually lead to him being appointed as dictator for life of Rome. Unprecedented, has never happened before. So Julius Caesar's army was always known to be strong, motivated men. Rarely were they ever timid on the battlefield. But at this battle, they were particularly tired. They were tired and timid. Julius Caesar had marched his army quite aggressively so that they could catch up to their enemy, right? And instead of giving them time to rest, Caesar actually saw a prime opportunity to fight in this battle. He didn't want to wait, so he ordered his men to charge, right? Now, they obviously weren't happy about this. They much would have preferred to have some time and relax a little bit, but they begrudgingly agreed and began to charge. As they got closer, though, the enemy started throwing these spears, these 6-foot javelins their way, and Julius Caesar's men started getting hit left, right, and center. Bodies falling to the ground. Picture this. All of a sudden, in the face of an enemy that was likely to wipe them out, this great Julius Caesar's great army began to look a little timid. They started to slow down. They lost some motivation. In fact, some people started fleeing the battlefield. And this is the worst thing that could possibly happen in Julius Caesar's mind. They began to become fearful. So what does Julius Caesar do when he sees this? It was standard practice at the time for a commander, if their soldiers started fleeing the battlefield or didn't want to listen to their commands, what they would do is they would take a few people and they would just kill them. Right? They'd kill them in front of the other soldiers to make an example out of them. And so it was considered standard practice at the time. And so if Julius Caesar did it, nobody would have really batted an eye, right? At the very least, it was expected that Julius Caesar would have taken a few of these guys, beaten them up in front of everybody else to make sure, you don't want to cross me, and set them, use them as an example. But he knew that this was not the way that he wanted to get his men to fight. The reason is that if his men fought begrudgingly or because they were afraid for their lives, they wouldn't respect him. They wouldn't take him as a leader. And so, if he wanted his men to respect him as a leader in the future, he would have to reignite the fire that was in their hearts. That's what he would have to do. And so, how does somebody do that? So, he had this idea. He pushes his way to the front of the army. Right to the front line. He's sizing up his men. He's looking his men up and down. He's looking at them in their eyes. And he goes and he takes his helmet off in front of his entire army. In the middle of a battlefield, takes off his helmet in the middle of this battlefield and starts to question their bravery. Now, we don't actually know exactly what he said, but likely he brought up their past battles, their past victories. He was saying to them, really? Is this all you have? I thought you were brave men. I thought you were the greatest fighters. I thought you were the greatest army. And now, you're what? Timid? You're weak? You're not strong? And he starts saying this. And then he turns toward the enemy army, draws his sword, helmet off, unprotected, and charges. One man against an entire army. Now, this took his men by surprise. They were completely shocked. They couldn't believe what was happening. And it was like a miracle. They were jolted with a newfound motivation and newfound vigor. Their commander, this commander that had taken them time and time again through victory, was now going into battle by himself. And so quickly, without even a second thought, his men went and started protecting Caesar and rallied right behind him, right into the battle. Now, the battle is now in full effect. His men are excited. They have this passion within their hearts, and they're fighting. Now, Julius Caesar doesn't just take this and go back and, take shelter again. He actually stays there on the front line with his soldiers throughout the entire battle, throughout the entire day, fighting with his men. Lesson number 1, never, and I mean never, ask your men or your people to do something that you wouldn't be willing to do yourself. To risk what you wouldn't be willing to risk. To put in hours that you wouldn't be willing to put in. And Caesar understood this. Why is this strategy so effective? Why is it so effective? Well, it all has to do with respect. We as human beings cannot respect somebody that eats off of a silver platter, that sits on a high horse when we are there doing the hard work and going through the struggles. We don't respect somebody who doesn't struggle as we struggle, who we cannot relate to on a personal level. And Julius Caesar's men felt ashamed that their leader, their commander, who was more likely older and weaker than them physically, had the courage that they didn't have in that moment. And because of that, the fire was ignited in their heart, and they took charge without even thinking about it. And this takes us to our second example. Julius Caesar was notorious for marching beside his men. Yeah, he was actually very notorious for not only marching his men, but marching them very quickly, right? There are many cases where his enemy army would be met on battlefields that they didn't expect because they just miscalculated how fast Julius Caesar actually marched his men. He would march them very, very quickly, and they would make haste in their way to battle. And the thing is, yeah, he made them make haste, but he was right there beside them. He was right there willing to basically put his money where his mouth was. And he was marching side by side with them, with his soldiers. And this is something that he was notorious for doing that no other commander really did at the time. He was also notorious for eating with his soldiers in their mess halls, in these big halls. And he would tell stories with them, and he would share in their grief, and he would share in their hardship. Right? He wouldn't actually even call his men soldiers. He would call them comrades. That's what he would call them. He was their brother, and they were his friend. And that's how he saw them, and that's how they saw him. Even when he was consul, even when he was commander, even when he was a high-ranking individual, he never made his men feel that way. He took it to such a level that he actually memorized the names of all of his centurions. Now, centurions were leaders of a centurion, and a centuria is basically the functional unit of a Roman army. It's basically a grouping of like 80 to 100 men, and these were, you could call them individual Lego pieces in the greater army, right? So a centurion's 80 to 100 men, and they would basically have all of these centurions. So, imagine how many centuria there were, and Julius Caesar memorized the names of every single centurion, the leaders of these basically 80 to 100 men, right? Now, these weren't generals. These weren't really high-ranking individuals. These were just usually better soldiers, kind of these mini leaders within the army, right? And no other commander did this. He made an effort, and he would call upon them using their first name. He would know things about his people, and he made an effort, and he deliberately did this. This was an intentional action. He didn't do this accidentally, right? He did this intentionally, right? So that his centurions knew that their commander had their back, that they felt a personal investment in the cause that they were fighting for, that they wanted to support this man. Forget about everything else. We're behind this man because he's my brother and he's my friend. Lesson number 2. The best leaders don't go out of their way to make sure everybody knows they're a leader. They don't try and make themselves seem above others or their team. Julius Caesar was so great at doing this. He brought himself not necessarily down. He didn't even see it as he was bringing himself down. He brought himself to the level of his foot soldier. He was right there, side by side with them. How could a leader who is side by side with his people, who is side by side with his centurions, who is side by side with his other generals, how could this leader ever be hated? And because of this, he was able to rally the hearts of his men, to push them harder than most other generals and commanders ever throughout history. He was able to get to a place of leadership where he was actually appointed dictator, and the general populace of the people in Rome actually liked it, right? We all know Julius Caesar was assassinated in the end by his senators, but those were other people in power, right? The general public was actually in favor of him being dictator, and that's not something that a lot of people know. People liked him as their leader. Especially the masses, they loved Julius Caesar because they saw him as an honorable man, as a man who was really doing good for them as individuals. He was at their level. He understood them at a personal level. And so this brings us to the end of today's episode. And like I promised, I'm going to be giving you guys some homework. Today's homework is simple. It's a 5-minute reflection, and I just want you to ask yourself a few questions. Question number 1. Am I asking my team to do anything that I would hate doing or be unwilling to do myself? Am I telling them to do something unapologetically, knowing that I would never do this in a million years? And if you're doing that, why? And you better have a good reason, because in Julius Caesar's eyes, he would never allow for such a thing to happen. The second question, have I taken any measures? Have I done anything to learn about my team on a personal level? Do I even care about them as human beings? It's a bit of a harsh question, but seriously, their passions, what they like to do, who they truly are, who their family is, where they're from, what their hobbies are. Have we actually taken the time to learn this about the people who we lead? And how can we call ourselves leaders if we don't even know these fundamental questions about our team? Or am I just interested in what I want and the results I want to see? Am I just interested in the project that we have at hand? And the second that that project is complete, and the second that I get out of them what I want, then I don't care about them. That's the question we have to ask ourselves. And I want you to set the intention that from now on, from this video on, from today forward, the next time you talk to your team, the next time that you talk to whoever it is who you might be a leader for, it might not even be a team, it might be your own family, that you set the intention, that you will make an intentional effort to learn more about those people, what makes them tick, their passions, their dreams, the things that they love, and to learn more about them as individuals rather than as pawns on a board towards your own victory. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode on what sets them apart. We talked about Julius Caesar, two of the biggest, in my opinion, the most fundamental strategies that made him one of the greatest leaders of all time, right? A leader so great that most people know his name today. Even though they might not know a lot about him, they still remember him as a leader. If you guys enjoyed today's episode, please let us know what you thought in the comment section. Leave us ratings on all the platforms. In next week's episodes, be sure to tune in. We'd love to hear your guys' feedback about how we're doing, what you like, what you dislike. Leave us constructive feedback. We're open to changing. We're open to improving. We're all on this path together, and I hope you guys go out there today and set yourself apart.